Thanks for attending our webinar today. The topic today is setting your strategic board agenda. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 40 to 45 odd minutes. Firstly, thanks for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here. Now, during the session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering as many of these as we have time for during the session. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we seriously hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into our draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those who do not know BoardPro, we're a board software provider that serve just over 20,000 users around the world. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively with our clever software, with less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. Now, as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. Today, let me introduce our panelists for you, starting with Brett Herpt, who is our co-founder and CEO here at BoardPro. Brett is a serial entrepreneur, having built several high-growth businesses over the last 20 years. Brett brings tenacity, a strategic mindset, strong generalist business skills, and enduring curiosity to the table. Kia ora, Brett.
Kia ora, everyone, and welcome.
Stephen Bowman is Managing Director of Conscious Governance and brings a great depth of experience with board reviews and strategic planning. Stephen has a wealth of executive and governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy. Good morning, good afternoon to you, Stephen.
And good morning and good afternoon to everyone around the world.
Linda Carroll is CEO of Align Group. Linda has over 20 years governance experience combined with over 30 years experience working with boards, CEOs and senior managers aligning strategy, governance, culture, and performance. Linda's experience spans the wider sector and not-for-profit sector boards, and she is also an accredited foresight practitioner through the Institute of the Future in California. Good afternoon to you, Linda.
Kia ora.
So for the next 45 minutes, just relax, sit back, listen, and add to the discussion by posting any questions you may have. The full recording of the webinar, along with the presentation deck, the white paper, and the Word template will be sent to you at the conclusion of today's session. So let me now hand over to Stephen Bowman to get us started.
Thanks for that. Today, we're going to have a conversation about this whole notion of a strategic board agenda. But one of the things I want us to do as we go through and have this conversation, and Linda and Brett and I will be riffing in some of the areas and looking at it from different perspectives. But there's no point in having a really well set out board agenda if you don't have really powerful, useful board reports that support the agenda. And then that's of no good unless we as directors are actually asking questions and really getting down to what we need to focus on as directors when we're having a board meeting. So it's not just the agenda in its own right, but it's also the reports that support it, and also the questions and the conversations we have as directors that actually make our board meetings really powerful, so that we can create the future through our board meetings rather than monitor how busy the staff are being. So one of the things I wanted to say is, first of all, designing a strategic board agenda. And the reason I've called it a strategic board agenda, because what it does is it should be focusing on the future and creating the future, not just getting reports on what has been in the past. And even if we do get reports on what has been in the past, we should be discussing the implications for the future from those reports. So immediately, if we start looking at it like that, then immediately our reports can start getting smaller and starting to focus more on the strategic implications for the future. So we'll give you some examples as we go through that. Now, the reason I've put this one up first about the chair owns the sequence of events. Many chairs, and certainly most directors, don't actually know that at law, the chair owns the agenda, not the board. The board does not own it. The chair owns it. It is the key mechanism for which to manage and support the discussions and the decision making around the board table. And there's nothing worse than an agenda that is developed by a committee. Now, that doesn't mean that you ignore your committee members, you don't ignore your board members, but in the end, it's the chair that actually owns the agenda. So it means that the chair needs to be involved in firstly approving the agenda. Usually the chief executive or the company secretary will have the first draft. But the purpose of the chair reviewing it is because they need to ensure at the chair level that we're focusing on the things that the board is best suited to spending its time on. And quite honestly, if your board meetings are a little operational, primarily it's the chair that's created that as the culture within the organization and at the board. And what we want to do today is to give you some tools and techniques to change that so that we're actually focusing on the key discussions that need to be had. Typically, when you're setting up an agenda, you'll be developing up the various elements that the board needs to talk about. And we'll go through that in a bit more detail. And Linda and I will have a chat about it. And Brett's got some very practical ideas on this as well too. But before you even start, we need to remind our board members of why they're meeting. And they're not meeting to go through the agenda. They're meeting to create the vision of the organisation. And so therefore it makes sense that at the start of our agenda, we put our vision right at the top to remind directors why we're there. But also as a director, I should be using that vision statement to help shape conversations. So that's the first tip that we'll give you. Put your vision at the top of every agenda. I would say that probably 80% of boards do not do this. So they're using the agenda as a mechanism to manage operational reports rather than guidance about creating the future. And your vision statement really gets you up there. Linda, you would have come across many examples, I'm sure, of organisations that also have mission moments at the start of their board meeting. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about?
They either have their vision statement or mission statement. And I think your idea, Stephen, of putting it at the top of the agenda is just such a lovely one because it really does focus the mind. And if people actually write that statement in terms of what does the world have as a result of you, or what does your region or your customer base have as a result of you, then it's really written in such a way that every conversation you have should be assisting you to actually deliver on that. I think it's a grand thing to do, Stephen, and I think very few organisations actually do it.
We had an example this morning. I was sitting in a board meeting and one of the directors, and there's always one director on a board who is a bit of a perfectionist. Now, what's really interesting is if you look up the word perfection, it means to find fault with. And that's actually, do a definition of search of what is perfectionism. It's to find fault with. And the conversation that we had was fabulous this morning because this person was nitpicking about some of the faults that they'd found. And then I invited them to look at the vision at the top of the agenda and to reframe their commentary to address the issues of the vision. And all of a sudden, the conversations changed from nitpicking to, here are some of the bigger issues that this incident has actually addressed, is giving the insight into, but they could not have done it without actually having a bit of a prompt behind it. So very powerful. Okay, so put your vision at the top and please use it shamelessly in everything. Help it to shape your conversations. So that's the first little hint. The second hint is always strategy ahead of operational matters. And I'll give you really practical examples of this. How many times do you have the first half of your meeting is spent talking about those items that we should never have talked about, which are the operational reports. And then right at the very end, we tend to get into the strategy side of things. So always strategy but ahead of operational matters. It doesn't have to be in the logical order. The logical order should be creation of the future. Now, what are the rats and mice things that we need to talk about towards the end? So the difficulty is if you put the operational reports, things like the CEO's report, for example, it's an operational report. And it should be towards the end. If there's a strategic issue in there, you pull that out as a board briefing paper separately to the CEO's report. So if there's something that is worthy of board discussion, that is a strategic issue, then you pull it out as a separate one-page board briefing paper So they don't have to read through the whole report, which may have some interesting background and updates in it, but there's nothing there we really need to discuss. If we do need to discuss something, then we pull it out from the actual paper itself and do a separate board briefing paper.
Can I jump in there, Stephen?
Of course, Brett.
We had a wonderful conversation yesterday when we were doing the briefing for this, and it really struck me that there's almost like a four-part circle going on where the organisation, the board, needs to have its vision and then its strategy. How's it going to achieve its vision top of mind? Incumbent on the chair and the CEO to reinforce that, and then in the agenda and the reporting. So if we're linking those four things together continuously, just seemed like a wonderful opportunity to just keep that organisation focused on strategy. Is there anything you'd add to that, Stephen?
No, that's pretty much what it is. One of the things that most boards, as part of their agenda, have what's called the CEO's report. BoardPro have done a great white paper on that, and you can get on their website and download it. But one of the things that I found very powerful with a CEO's report is, for the first heading in that CEO's report is, what keeps me awake at night? And the reason for that is, I guarantee that's the first thing that every director will read in their board pack before they read anything else. What's keeping our CEO awake at night time? And it's not there to scare them. It's just to give them an insight into what it is that you as a CEO are really focusing your attention on without going into a whole lot of detail. And it also doesn't necessarily need any sort of discussion. As a board, we're not there to fix it. We're there to be aware of what the CEO is keeping awake. And if the CEO wants the board to have a discussion around this, pull out a separate briefing paper about that one issue. Linda, thoughts?
Oh, look, I completely agree. It's really important when your mind is fresh and when you haven't got tired through actually being, through a whole agenda, that you deal with the really important strategy stuff. And that's that forward-looking matters rather than in your rear vision mirror. And I agree, and what they're being kept awake at night gives you a really good steer as to what your critical risks are.
Yeah. So put that in as a heading on your CEO's report. Now, here are some of the sort of the rules of the game when it comes to constructing agendas. And I would say, again, about 70% of boards do not do this. And if you do this, I guarantee it will chop about 30% off the top of your board meeting time. So the notion of using a consent agenda, many of you have come across this. A consent agenda says, look, there are three types of papers. There's one that is for information only, not for discussion, in brackets, not for discussion, in highlights, not for discussion. It's for noting only, for information only. The second type of paper is one that is a discussion. We don't need to decide anything, but we do need to have a lay of the land and have a discussion about where to from here. And the third type of paper is a paper that has a resolution attached to it, or we need to decide something. We need to make a decision. Always those three types of paper. Now, where the trick of this is that all those papers that are for information only, you can put in a block at the end of the agenda. They're information only. And that's why we call it a block agenda. Those items that are for noting, that are for information only, not to be talked about, are put in a block. And at the start of the agenda, we approve all those papers as read. Now, if a director, and there's always one or two, has something that they'd like to discuss in these items for noting, you must insist that they petition the chair prior to the board meeting to elevate that item back onto the discussion agenda, but they've got to convince the chair. And the way you convince the chair is you talk to the chair about the strategic issue you think needs to be discussed, not the particular element in that report. Elevate the conversation up. Look, I'd like to talk about this item for noting that is about the latest issue in our master plan. And the reason I'd like to talk about it is I think it's going to have a major impact on how we deal with our stakeholders. I'm making this up, of course, and when it comes to strategic stakeholder engagement, I'd like the board to have a real conversation around strategic stakeholder engagement, which has been triggered by this master plan report that came through. And as a chair, I'm going to say, well, that's a good idea. The one thing is, what I don't want to hear as a director in any of my boards, I don't want to hear oh, this item that's for noting, I do have something I'd like to bring to the board. I never want to hear that at the board meeting. I want to hear it prior to. And then I need to convince the chair that it's an issue worthy of discussion. Now, for those of you who have directors who say, I can talk about anything I like at the board meeting, the answer to that is no, you can't.
Stephen, I have a few questions that have just come through
fire
here.
away.
One from Christian says, so no decisions unless raised at the meeting in general business? Question.
I'm not sure I understand that one. Linda,
Okay, well,
Yeah, I think it's about the blocking. And so you're presumably going to go on, Stephen, and talk about how you then block your decision-making papers together.
yes. Okay, so general business, my view is if you've got something called general business, get rid of it. It has no place in an agenda these days. What should replace it, however, is strategic issues for board consideration. Give it a heading that tells what it is. If you have something in there that is general business, people will bring up general stuff. And we don't want them to bring up general stuff. We want them to bring up issues that are worthy of board discussion. And that should be prior to the board meeting, not at the board meeting.
But I just chime in.
Yeah,
go ahead, Brett.
Just chime in there quickly, Stephen. I think if we summarize this, I think you're basically saying a good board meeting is a proactive board meeting, and that my observation is so many board meetings, if you allow the decisions or the major discussion to be reactively occur in the meeting, you're more likely to have a chaotic or less focused meeting than if people actually do the hard work beforehand and decide what's important to talk about.
That's absolutely correct. Linda?
Yeah, I agree. And you're looking at the agenda, you've got a strategic agenda, and you've basically clustered the papers according to what is important to deliver on your strategy. So is it actually a conversation or a decision that's going to make your waka go faster towards that Northern Star?
Two more questions, team. Our board often have difficulty separating strategy from operations. Every topic can be both. So what's the quick test to really get to the guts of a strategic matter?
Strategy is about creating the future. So is this a question about something that's happened in the past and why that happened in the past? Or is there a strategic question behind that about what implications does that mean for the next few years and how we might actually do or look at our decisions differently coming up into the future? Often you'll get people asking these operational style questions because that's what they're used to. We have to assist them to elevate that. And as we go through, hold on to that thought, because I'll give you some really powerful techniques you can use to ensure that our board reporting is supporting the strategic focus rather than inviting our directors to dive down into the rabbit hole of operational detail. And there's some very easy ways of doing that. But let's cover through some more of this.
Just before we do, Stephen, and hopefully not stealing your thunder, when we talked about this yesterday, you had a great tip of how you gave us that story of a question that came up and you asked them to reframe it in context with your strategy, which was a way of lifting them out of a rabbit hole or the past or operations and into having a strategic mindset.
One of the best questions that a director can ask if someone has gone down the operational path of wanting some more detail about something, one of the best questions you can ask is, what's the strategic issue behind what you've just asked that is worthy of our time as a board?
Brilliant.
And that really helps elevate that conversation. And often a director will pull out actually a really important issue, but they got focused on looking at the incident or that one bit of information that they wanted without looking at the implications of that.
That's a really good. Sorry, you go on, Stephen. Let's keep rolling.
No,
I was just going to say, I think it's really important to note that directors are human beings as well. And often it's easy to get frustrated with them being operationally focused. We've heard that many times at Board Pro and our validation stage and over the years. But quite often they do have something important or strategic. They don't know how to phrase it, or they haven't learned to phrase it in that way. So part of the job of the chair in particular, and I'd venture the CEO, is to help them get it into the best possible frame for the organisation.
Yep.
Stephen, Helen asked if you would repeat that question, please. The question to ask when a director goes into the operational detail of things.
It's along the lines of what is the strategic issue behind what it is that you have just described to us? What is the bigger issue that is worthy of board discussion?
Excellent. Thank you.
So something along those lines.
I've typed that into the answer, so you'll have it, Helen.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
I've put board-owned risks here because probably the worst style of reporting that I've come across is in reporting against risk. Typically, boards will get every now and then, not all the time, every now and then a risk report that lists down the 47 risks on our risk register. And it's a waste of everyone's time. What the board has to get is an ongoing conversation around our top 3 or 4 key risks, how we are leveraging those risks, which means we manage the potential to occur and we manage the impact if it does occur, and how we can leverage that both into either new business, new services, or new revenue streams. And if we start looking at risk from that perspective, then your risk reporting becomes just not some sort of passive, here's the stuff the staff are doing. It becomes a strategic conversation about leveraging and opportunities that arise from us actually understanding and managing these top 3 or 4 key risks really well. So that's one of the things that I'd point out is probably the worst area, apart from finances. They're pretty bad as well too. All right, let's move on. So dashboards, dashboards are becoming more and more popular. And unfortunately, they also can be quite a distraction. They look pretty and they've got nice things going up or going down and they're in color and they're all on a page. And I'm still left with the, what do you want me to do with them? And there's a dashboard, so what? So one of the things that I encourage everyone to look at is any board report that's coming up to you should answer the so what question. So what do you want me to focus on with this? Don't give me a 5-page or a 10-page report. Tell me right up, so what do you want me to focus on? One of the things that I alert everyone to is that board packs these days, the whole suite of materials that we provide for a board meeting, some of them run up to 500, 600, 700 pages. And the difficulty with that is that you are giving the board members an awful lot of information without giving them any guidance about what they should be focusing on. So there's 2 key tools that you can use to help you do that. Number 1 is to make sure that the board reports going to the board very clearly answer the so what question. So what? You're telling me this, so what? If there is no so what, then it becomes a paper for noting. It's not worthy of discussion. So when you look at things like your finance report or your profit and loss report, most of those are so what reports because they're not telling me what I should focus on. One of the biggest tricks of the trade that you can add tomorrow into your finance reports, your P&L and your balance sheet, is to have a heading at the bottom of your P&L report that says strategic implications for board discussion. Strategic implications for board discussion. Now that's a multi-syllabic way of saying, so what do you want me to focus on? With your balance sheet, same thing. Your balance sheet is a series of ratios. So you can develop up what the ratios might be that are supported by the balance sheet, but at the bottom of the balance sheet, I want to see a heading that says strategic implications for board discussion. Don't make me work for it. Give me a heads up of what you think we as a board should be focusing our attention on with this particular report. Now, if there is no strategic implication, then put in nil. But the fun bit of that is that a director might be reading the report and they say, oh, the author of this report doesn't see a strategic implication, but I do. Bingo. All of a sudden, they've elevated the report to something that is worthy of discussion because they've identified a strategic implication, which they can alert the chair to prior to the board meeting.
I think this is incredibly valuable for our audience, Stephen. So let's do a practical example, and I might kick us off there. And Linda, I'd love to draw you in too. For us as an organisation, we've grown our staff numbers, we've expanded our senior leadership team. We're in a transition phase, building out the leadership infrastructure and the relationships that can allow our business to go to the next stage. So are you suggesting, as an example, within my CEO report, I might just have a little paragraph, strategic implications. Hey, we're in a risk moment because of X, Y, and Z, or this is the key opportunity to set up for getting to our next revenue target.
Yeah, don't leave it up to the directors to try and reinterpret what you've got there. They will interpret anyway, but give them some assistance with it. And that is a discussion worthy of having, rather than someone having to read through the whole report trying to figure out. The other tool that I'll give you that helps with this, and I think this is particularly relevant for Australian and New Zealanders, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. And that is, when looking at a board report, you need to tell me, where's Wally? Where's Wally? Brett, can you bring up, sorry, Sean, can you bring up that picture of where's Wally?
I sure can.
Some people won't know what we're talking about here, but this is Wally. This is this thing called where's Wally. Now, somewhere in there is a really important piece of information. Don't make me search for it. Tell me where it is. Pull it out separately so that I'm not spending half an hour trying to find out where's, and that's, sorry,
I was just
Linda.
going to say, Sean, that's where sometimes those dashboards can be really useful, because they basically give you a picture at a very high level of where everything's at. And through color coding, or just through the way they are graphically portrayed, they highlight for you as a director where Wally is. And then you can actually, maybe in your supplementary papers or whatever, there might be more information around key things, but you've got the core of what you need to know in a dashboard. So sometimes that's how they can be helpful. But goodness, give me a paper of 50 pages and I'll be searching through there trying to find Wally, and it just makes me frustrated when it's so difficult to find.
Exactly.
So jumping in there again, sorry, this is such a rich conversation. There's almost a job for the CEO as they come to the end of the reporting cycle, and it's so easy to report your profit or your growth or your customer feedback, etc., is to go, well, what in this month or period's report it makes the most difference to creating that future. Make that decision, probably get on the phone to the chair. Do you agree? Finalize the report and send it off, and you've proactively got on the front foot.
Exactly. Perfect. Let's skip this one. You'll see this as we go through and actually have a look at a draft agenda. Right now, this is the fun part. Now, please, everyone who's on this call, don't try and read what's on the screen. You'll get copies of all this, and you will also get an example from Board Pro about how they go about doing it. But what I want to do is to take you through the key headings on this, right? So there's the vision statement there underneath the name of the agenda. Now, go down to present, to be present. So you've got present, the board, present from management, apologies. Now, here's a simple little thing. Never accept an apology from a director unless they have shown you, the chair, that they have read the board papers and they either have questions or they have no questions. Don't accept their apology if they just ask for an apology, if they give you an apology. Do not accept it. Now, a person who's written in the notes before, what do you do with directors who don't read papers? There's two things you can do with this. All right, number one is, if they can't attend a board meeting, then you have to say to them, you need to have read the board papers, come back to me with a statement that you've read them and that you either have no questions or here are the two questions you'd raised on your behalf. Under that circumstance, I'll give you an apology for the board meeting. Now, there's a whole topic in there, but this is, the law says you are always, there is no, you can't have a leave of absence, for example. It's rubbish, because you still must get the board papers, you still must read them, you still must get back to the chair or the CEO, typically the chair, with any questions that you've got. You have to participate. You can't not participate. So we go, welcome, apologies, declarations. Here you go. The first declaration that my directors have reviewed the material ahead of the meeting. This is great. So it has no force of law, but gee, I tell you, it gets directors focused, because they're either going to say, yes, I have, or they're going to say, no, I haven't, and they'll feel embarrassed, or they're going to lie and they'll know they've lied. So if you really want to start changing behavior, you can start building this into your agenda. And then you've got the next declaration is any declarations of interest. Now, please don't call this conflict of interest. There's still about 70% of boards call this declaration of conflict of interest. No, there's no conflict until the board decides there's a conflict. I want to know what any interests that aren't on the interest register that have come up since the last meeting, let us know, or alert me to something that we need to know about. But it's not a conflict at this stage. It may be. Only the board decides if there's a conflict. Linda, I can see you want to say something.
Oh, yeah, just this is a key point and one that's critical, because if you are going to call it a conflict of interest, then I, as a director, determine what needs to go on the interest register and what's a conflict.
Yeah.
If we say it's an interest register, then you put everything down and the board as a whole decides whether it's a conflict. It's not up to you. And so that is the fundamental difference as I see it. And it's critical, because otherwise people are leaving themselves vulnerable by using a conflict of interest register.
The law in the Commonwealth nations, and it's the same in the US, the law very clearly says that it's the board's right to decide whether there's a conflict, but it's the director's obligation to alert of any interests. Okay, so anyway, so there's some really cool stuff in here. So the next item on there is confirmation of minutes. So that's part of your block agenda. Confirmation of any action items, that's fine. They're for noting. We don't need to talk about them, okay? Now, the next heading, strategic matters, and underneath that will come all the things that is worthy of the board time that have a strategic priority. And the first one we've got up there is the CEO and executive team report on strategic priorities. Now, why doesn't they say the CEO's report on strategic priorities? Because the CEO is only part of the team that does this. I'd much prefer to see this as a CEO and executive team report that talks about those items that are worthy of discussion, not for noting, that come out of the strategic priorities or the strategic plan. And then the next are other examples of strategic issues that are worthy of time of the board's discussion. So any other strategic matters that are worthy of the board's discussion go in that area. The next one is board operations. All right, this is the work of the board. So this is where your finance, audit and risk committee minutes might be. But if there is something that is worthy of board discussion, then you pull it out as a separate briefing paper. So typically there'll be papers for noting unless there's something that a director wants to raise, and they should raise it prior to the board meeting. So these are where your minutes of your committees come from. But if there's something the board needs to discuss, pull it out as a separate board briefing paper. Then you get on to the next heading, which is the professional board development. Now, all these items don't need to be in every board agenda. We want, for example, every second or third board meeting an external stakeholder to come into the board meeting and have a conversation with us about what they see as their top two or three strategic issues, and what they think the implications for our organisation or our sector might be. The same thing with staff, 1 or 2 times a year. Anyway, you can read through that, but that really is then the board operation side of things. Changes to strategic environment, or my favourite topic here is strategic gossip. What have you heard and what do you think the strategic implications for us might be? This should replace other business. Other business has no right being in your board agenda because it encapsulates often very mundane operational issues that the directors sort of sneak into the agenda. If it's worthy of having on the agenda, it's worthy of getting the chair's support for it. And if you can't talk to the chair prior to the meeting, then this is where you might bring this up, this last item. The next one is the standing reports, the operational matters that are just for board noting. So CEO report, CFO report, unless there's something we need to bring out as a board discussion paper. The next section is the board in-camera session. Now, we've actually changed that now to call it the board-only session. In Australia and the Commonwealth countries, they tend to like Latin terms, so in-camera means out of session. In America, they call it executive session, just to confuse it. But most of the other countries that I've come across call it board-only. And there's a whole discussion around what should be in that, but that's typically where that would go. And the same thing with your meeting review after that. The key point in...
Sorry, we just have a comment here from Pamela. She said, I use Board Pro, however, it does not look like this layout does. Hamlet will show you just shortly how this does actually roll into Board Pro.
Can you do that now, Sean?
Sure.
Because that's really important. So you'll all get a copy of this template, but it's the thinking that's important. Every one of your board agendas will look slightly different to what we had there, but the thinking is the most important part. And what Board Pro have done, they've sat down with me and also our colleague Graham Narkis, and we've gone through this to make sure that it translates to a board portal sort of format.
Yeah, so if you look on the right-hand side, Stephen's document, on the left-hand side is that translated into Board Pro layout, if you like, or Board Pro speak, including strategic matters, board operations. And as Steve mentioned, if there are things that don't need to be in the meeting, you can just delete them. If you want to move topics around, you can just do that very easily. So this is just a baseline template for you to use in your meetings off the back of this great document that Graham and Stephen have put together for you. This actual document will be sent to you after this session.
The other thing I'd mention too is that there's a heading in there called Purpose under Note for Administrators and Directors. That's got in there what those little call-out boxes on my agenda have. So it's actually probably the best professional development that your board and your chair will ever get about agenda management, just in this one template.
So quick question for you, Sean. That question was from an existing user. Is there a way for existing users to get a version of this template that we've mocked up?
Yep, there sure is. Users just need to contact support either on chat or on email, support@boardpro.com, and ask for the template to be added to their account.
So if I can just summarize where we come from here, in terms of the board agenda, number one, the chair owns it. Number two, directors can petition the chair to put items that they think are strategically important. As part of that, some other tricks of the trade are when we're developing up board reports, then some boards have set the following protocol in place. Prior to the board meeting and before the board pack actually goes out to all directors, the draft of the board pack gets sent to the chair, and the chair spends between 30 minutes and an hour going through the draft board pack, ensuring the papers in the board pack are concise and answer the so what question or the where's Wally question. And if they don't answer that, they send it back to the CEO so that the person who's in charge of writing that report can make the amendments that help focus the board directors during the meeting. The biggest issue we've got is that if you put something in a board pack, then board directors assume they have to read it. Now, think back to the last time your board pack was 300 pages, 400 pages, 500 pages. And the reason for that is that there was probably a whole report in there from someone that we wanted the board to have access to, that there was a very large analysis that went behind something. They should all be what we call optional reading. If you put it in the board pack, then the directors will automatically think they have to read it. If they don't have to read it, and if it's there for information and might be good background, clearly mark it as optional reading with a link to go and read it, but don't put it in the actual board pack. Don't send it out, but have it there as something they can read. Psychologically, if it's in front of us and as part of something called a board pack, we feel as directors, we've got to read the damn thing, which means that if I'm reading 3 or 4 pages, that's just made the where's Wally so much more difficult. We're not focusing on what we need to.
Have a couple of questions, team. This is from Maz a little bit earlier on. Maz says, we have board-only time with the managers not present. How does this fit into the agenda? What areas of the discussion is this appropriate for?
So briefly, board-only time is typically done either at the start of a board meeting or at the end of a board meeting, and there's pros and cons for both. Personally, I like at the end of a board meeting. My colleague Graham, and I don't know Linda's view on this, but he likes it at the start of the board meeting. And the purpose of the board-only meeting is not to have a moan and a complaint about things. It's to talk about issues where it's not relevant to have the staff involved. So it might be around the CEO's performance. It might be around the culture of the board that we want to create. It might be actually performance management that could be part of that as well too. Linda?
Yeah, we actually do both. So at the start, we have board-only time just for the board to catch up on the areas of importance that they have identified in their board pack that they're keen to actually cover, and to make sure everyone is on the same page. And at the end of the board meeting, it's basically a heads up. Did we actually add value today? How did we add value today? What would we do differently if we were looking at having that day again? So it doesn't take long, but we do both. And I can see, Stephen, that you have the rationale for either or in the same way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pamela
Okay.
asks, is it the chair or the CEO who signs off on the board pack before distribution to directors, or both?
My view is it should be both.
Let's create
Because,
the
yeah,
controversy here. Linda, you have an alternative. You had a challenging view when we discussed this.
Yeah, look, there's two things as chair causes maybe a little concern. One is that it means that management have to be ahead of the game even more in terms of providing the board pack earlier than they would. So if you meet monthly and your annual board work plan is driven by particular dates that are within your business, then you're going to be asking management to provide the board pack earlier than they would otherwise need to, so that the chair has time to go through it. Now, Stephen said it only put aside 30 minutes to review the board pack. For me to read all of the board papers in a board pack before they go out will take me at least a day probably. And that is about what is in our board pack and whether or not we get too much probably. And we're working on that. We really need to, I think, provide training to managers who are writing papers and how to write a succinct board paper, because it's actually much harder.
Absolutely.
So I think there's pros and cons. Ideally, yes, you need to, I certainly know what's going to be in the papers. I certainly know the content of the agenda because I sign that off, but I get the director's involvement in that. But it's that thing of, do I actually read every single paper? No, I don't. And I think there'd be difficulty in getting that into my annual board work plan. But I agree with Stephen. If you can, it makes sense because it is your agenda.
See, the thing I would add to that is that when I say 30 minutes to an hour to review the board pack, really the only thing the chair should be reviewing are those items that have some sort of decision or discussion that is required, because the papers for noting, they're for noting so people can read them at their leisure. But usually what often happens is that the board reports that are put through where there is a decision to be made, you've got to read through a whole lot of stuff rather than focusing on what the real key issue is. And there's one organisation I know where the chair started doing this, and after about 2 board meetings, he didn't need to do it anymore because the culture of the board report writers had totally changed.
Thanks,
Hey,
Stephen.
I'm just going quick comment from me, Sean. I can see the questions are still pouring in. We will circle back to some of this material. I think, Sean, there's a good heads up for us to go deeper on this in future webinars.
Indeed, yep.
I can see one there that I can just quickly answer. The view of the company secretary's role in reviewing papers. Our company secretary would review the papers.
If they took that role on as I mentioned with the chair, if they looked at those papers and said this isn't answering the so what question, they send it back, then that is a huge step forward.
A little chime in there. Our company secretary is also our CFO, who I rely on pretty heavily to support me in managing upwards to the board. So we would tend to review all the papers together and support each other and making sure we pass the so what test.
We have a question also. What should be in your annual work plan that Linda mentioned? Slightly different topic, but do you want to answer that?
Have a look at the webinar that we did on creating an annual board work plan. It's got all the stuff you would ever want in that. It's really good.
Just on that, everybody, we have a webinar page on our website, boardpro.com/resources. You'll find all of the webinars that we've run over the last 18 months there for you, along with all the resources. Okay, our webinar today was the last actually in our Governance Made Easy series for 2022. We'll be taking a break over the summer and back online on February 8th, I think it is, for our first webinar of the year, which is Effective Board Governance for Early Stage Companies. Now, this is hosted by Kieran Newton from Australia, along with Simon Telfer, Danica Plowski, and Amanda Bolland. It'll be a great webinar to start the year on. We look forward to hosting this for you in February. Now, you'll receive an email from us shortly, which will include a video of today's webinar, of course, the presentation slides, the topic white paper, and of course, a copy of the Strategic Board Agenda template from Stephen and Graham. Now, as I mentioned before, we have a little special for you. Now, we don't normally do this on our webinars, but here it goes. So if you sign up for a trial of Board Pro between now and Friday, the 30th of December, our team will build the new strategic agenda template into your board account so that you can use it across your board meetings. The template will be available just a few days after your trial starts because it takes a little bit to build it in. As an added bonus, due to Christmas being in front of us, we'll extend your trial for a further 30 days. So it's a total of 60 days experiencing the value of Board Pro for you. And if you continue with a subscription with Board Pro, which we hope you do, you can continue to use the template, Steve's template, free of charge. And as I said, if you're an existing customer and you'd like the template to be added to your account, please reach out to us on chat or support@boardpro.com and the team will look after you. Now, just as you leave the webinar, I see a few already are, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey, go into the draw for our hamper worth $400. We'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar today. So thanks for your attendance, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the session. It was fast and furious. Thanks again to Stephen, Linda, and Brett. And finally, Merry Christmas, everyone. Have a great summer break with your families. We look forward to seeing you back in 2023 when we restart our webinar series on February 8th. Thanks so much.